Welcome to the Agriculture Policy Podcast, your go-to source for insights at the crossroads of farming, trade, and policy. I'm Josh Baethge, and today we're going to discuss the issue of government spending for agriculture and how effective it is in helping farmers. Joining me is Hansjürg Jäger, leading expert in international agriculture, trade, and policy. And Hansjürg, I know right now this is a big debate in both the United States, where I am, and in Switzerland. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that are going on right now in Switzerland in regards to government spending for agriculture and some of the possible changes that may be coming up where we are.
Well, hey Josh, good morning. Great to have you again in the show. I mean, if you ask me what is going on in ag policy debate, I mean, we could discuss it for quite some time. So I'd like to just reframe a little bit your question and start with the question, well, why do we need to talk about effectiveness in public spending at all? So, and is it also part of the ag policy debate as such? And to answer this part of the question, I would say, well, we do need to talk about the effectiveness because it's taxpayers' money. So it makes sense to spend it efficiently. And it is part of the ag policy debate, but not so much as you might expect.
Yeah, I think I see the same thing here. This is obviously an ongoing debate that goes back decades and will probably continue to go. I think specifically, as I see it, maybe you see it differently. We have the two issues of should government be spending money on agriculture, how much, and then the third would be and how should it be spent. So maybe I guess we could start with a little overview of how the spending programs work in Switzerland and compare it to how it is here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Shal. I could just give a very rough overview about Swiss style of spending. We do have if you look at agricultural support, two main instruments. One is border protection tariffs, and the other one is direct payments, mainly. Direct payments are tied to different rules, regulations. If you want to access direct payments, you have to to get some things right. You have to use a certain style of production. You have to be a bit more sustainable than if you don't want to access the payment. So we see there the public demands or demands of the society are embedded in the way payments are transferred from, let's say, the government to taxpayers, to the farmers. And how is it in the US? I believe it's much more liberal in terms of what the farmers have to do, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit different. I mean, obviously, tariffs, border security are big issues in the news right now with President Trump. President Trump obviously supports tariffs and is threatening a whole package of tariffs. We've talked about that a little bit in one of our previous episodes, and that how that's going to look is still ongoing. Border security, the president has taken a much harder line on border security, which is impacting farm labor. His stated goal is to have an all-American workforce, but the numbers tell you that's impossible because that domestic workforce doesn't exist currently. So that's led to a situation here where we have lots of undocumented workers going into farms. And a lot of farmers are raising concerns about taking away the labor force. It's estimated somewhere between 40 to 60% of agricultural laborers here are from outside of the United States, and if you restrict access to that, the question remains who is going to do this work. But probably the biggest news is, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, is what President Trump has called the Big Beautiful Bill. It was a budget bill passed in early July. And, an example what you're talking about included an additional almost $66 billion for farmers. And this included, more support for crop insurance programs. Basically, the government in the United States, farmers can buy crop insurance from private companies, and the government will pay you a certain percentage of that premium. Then there's also the commodity support programs, which are based on a baseline price. If it falls below that, then farmers are compensated accordingly. And the big debate is how much should the government support those programs? How much of that money should go to farmers? Because, like you said, there's this constant debate over how much government support should be there versus how much it should rely on the market. And I think some of these might be different. A lot of these are kind of similar questions you're having in Switzerland. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was just wondering myself, or asking myself that how is it then you have programs, then the political debate in the parliament saying why those programs are important or where they have to be adjusted. And if we do so in Switzerland, normally at the end, there is more money available for farming than in the beginning of the debate. So somewhere during the debate, there is always this question, okay, do we need more money? And then everybody says, yes, of course we do need more money. But for what reason exactly? And then the haggling begins. So the negotiation, what are the conditions to get more money out of it? And this is, I find it very striking. Agriculture, takes 3.5 billion of our governmental budget, which is around 5%. We have an annual spending of 85 billion per year. If you look at the government, 3.5 billion go to farming, so it's not that much. However, we do have as well to fight with debt. Our financial situation isn't as prosperous as you might expect. It's not that bad compared to the US. However, for Swiss standards, we're quite under pressure. So farming is there as an expense for the government. It's just it's not a tied expense. So this means the Federal Council has some marge de manœuvre for adjusting the budget. Compared, the Social Security, for instance, this is tied expense. You have to spend the money whether you have it or not because it's written in the law. And with farming, it's a bit less formally safe that the money is made available. So this leads to every year, if the government opens the debate about the budget, for sure the Federal Council proposes some budget cuts in agriculture. What then follows is like the Farmers Union says, hey, are you crazy? Are you insane? With several arguments. We have more rules to obey, international competition, income support, which remains important. So you can't cut our budget. On top, we are only, as I said, 5% of the budget, so we can't support you anyways that much. And then the parliament haggles, negotiates a bit to where to save money and where not. Usually at the end, farming is always, or the ag budget is always spared, which is from a lobbying perspective, you can say it's effective lobbying, but it shows as well the less important agriculture becomes in an economy, the less you have problems with political support. So this is something that we can see in Switzerland very clearly, and I believe it's similar in the US.
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, you're coming from a standpoint of where, like you said, it's overall agriculture is a small percentage amount of the total budget. But when people hear, say, like for example, the U.S. Farm Bill, and they say over a 5-year period that's going to cost 1.2 or 1.3 trillion dollars over 5
number
years.
Is still mind blowing to me.
It is mind blowing, but when you look at that over the entire budget, it's still not a huge part. So you have generally speaking, I think the political climate is generally supportive of agriculture. On the surface, farmers are respected on both political parties here, but there's also a large contingent of people, particularly on the Republican side, that want to see spending cuts in general, because the United States has a massive a budget deficit. Part of this is like you said, some of those programs that are written into law and are funded regardless, like Social Security. I think we refer to them as entitlement programs. And the laws are written like, no matter what the budget is, these people will get these benefits under certain conditions, and like Social Security, like nutrition funding. So those things tend to be a bigger part of the budget, and then so there's this desire to rein in costs. So like you said, this kind of contradiction of wanting to support farmers, wanting to rein in costs. And in the U.S., you have the added thing where there's been a big push to lower taxes. Part of President Trump's budget bill, where we saw some cuts in agricultural spending, or not in that bill, but upcoming some more cuts in agricultural spending are due to the desire to have tax breaks. So you're looking to provide more and then take in less, and it brings the budget up. So that kind of gets into this whole debate that kind of goes outside of agriculture. But generally speaking, yeah, it's always the same debate over how to spend money, how to save money, and so oftentimes farmers kind of get caught in the middle of that debate, which can get very political. Focusing on other things, accusations of waste, mismanagement, those type of things, to justify cuts, and it's a never-ending conversation.
And how about then the question of, we have those instruments and they have their advantages, their disadvantages, and we could say, well, ag policy evolves. So you take some learnings and then you adjust the policy framework or the instruments you use. And is there, at least in the US, a debate about the effectiveness? Like what instruments to incorporate, what instruments to phase out? Is there anything like that, or is there just the basic debate on, well, more money or no money?
That's the constant debate that goes back in the U.S. back to probably the 1930s, where there's a recognized need that you need some government support. The general consensus, basically because, like we've talked about before, you want to ensure a stable food supply. You want to ensure affordable food. Keep the population happy. You also have to give an incentive for farmers to produce a lot of food, but also make money. So you're trying to you make farmers profitable, keep food affordable, and basically avoid the volatility that would happen if and it's been proven time and time again. If you just left it solely to the market, from overproduction to shortages and higher prices. So the goal is to kind of do these sometimes counter priorities, and but as far as how to do it, that debate has been ongoing. In the past, U.S. tried restricting supply, making farmers just farm certain, only a certain percentage of their fields. That didn't work because farmers became more effective at getting more output from that, or planting other crops. Hey, you can't plant corn on this end, plant something else. So those kind of things have come out. We've tried, in particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, more focus on international trade and letting farmers export more of the products. But then, of course, that brought more competition. So each time there's a change, there's this equal reaction. So right now, the general consensus, I'd probably say for the last decade or two, I may be a tiny bit off on my timeline there, has been this, programs focusing on support based on commodities, crop insurance to protect farmers from whatever issues may affect their operations, disaster assistance. Those are the main programs, and then a whole list of other smaller programs to address smaller needs. And this has probably been the general consensus in the last 20 years, but at least. But within that, then you have debates over where is this more effective, and I'm assuming it's kind of a similar. Is it a similar thing in Switzerland? It's these constant, as farming evolves, the priorities evolve, and within that framework, is that kind of similar to what you have there?
Well, public support is often justified by the multifunctionality of agriculture. So what you said before as well is like food production landscape, the biodiversity, rural vitality. These are all aspects that agriculture plays an important role, and which justifies often public support, public spending. What is seldomly questioned is the effectiveness of the instrument. Of course, in the beginning, there's always this discussion, well, should we add new instruments or should we get rid of some? And then along the way, someone discovers that those instruments aren't not that bad for all the actors using them. So you are met with resistance to change instruments from certain groups. So it's from my perspective, it's much more often the case that instruments are added to serve very narrow or particular needs, but old ones aren't seldomly phased out. So, or only in or they are changed into new programs. So everybody tries to keep the money, which is then leading to this very interesting or sometimes even weird debate about the justification of the spending. So in economical terms, the effectiveness, well, it's not that much a public debate. It's much more the question, okay, how could we spend the money and for whom it will be? So this is much more the question and not at all about whether to spend or not. This is never ever a huge debate because it's for everybody clear, well, agriculture needs a certain support.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's kind of the general consensus here. But here too, that there's a recognized need for it. But then, like you said, who benefits? One of the issues we have in the U.S. is where there's been since the 1980s, a great deal of farms have been bought up by big corporations, and when you have these government programs that pay farmers, a lot of people, a certain amount when times are tough, a lot of people in their minds picture so it's a family farmer, they're receiving this. But when in some cases you could actually have an investor that's invested in lots of farm receiving, with the amount of acreage they have, mass sums of money to for these programs, when these corporations may or may not be hurting as much as, say, a family that depends on one or two crops. But so then you get into the debate over, do we restrict, do we cap the amount of spending that any one person can receive, and how much? That's an ongoing debate. There was an effort to put a higher or a lower monetary cap during the debate over the big beautiful bill that was passed, that was shot down. I'm curious about the differences between or the priorities of different farmers, different parts of agriculture. Do you see a debate sometimes about different priorities between, say, farmers that raise one type of crop versus others, where they might get contentious in those debates?
That's a very good question because it leads to the to the debates within agriculture. Yes, there are very sometimes contradicting expectations, which are for the unity of the Swiss Farmers Union quite dangerous. So they are often discussed very discreetly and in a way to integrate all the interests. So of course there is this discussion now upcoming whether the government should support more the plant-based production, or whether it should, and to whom's expense. So now you can say, okay, we can support plant-based production in a way that will be paid by dairy farmers, for instance, or other animal-based agricultural sectors. You take payment from there, you put it in the other market. But this debate is not existing. It's much more, the consensus is, well, there needs to be some measures. If the Swiss people should eat more plant-based protein, there need to be some measures to protect those markets. And it
Sure.
becomes apparent then that we will end up with a bit more support in general and not a shift in support.
Yeah,
And this shows, I mean, it's very complex. And what would you say in the US? It seems the system is a bit, less complex. I had the impression, but maybe I'm wrong.
It's complex. I don't know if it's any more complex than anything else in politics, because just like any other issue, you have these competing interests. So for example, when you have President Trump, we talked about earlier, putting in more tariffs. You have soybean farmers, for example, very concerned with tariffs on places like China and Mexico, where more than half of their crops from the U.S. go to those countries. So tariffs tariffs, which would initiate retaliatory tariffs from those countries, would be absolutely devastating for them. But then you have other industries that maybe are more concerned about products coming in and competing with them in the U.S. So they tend to support these more. So it's this constant battle of how do you enact policies and make everybody happy, and that at the end of the day comes down to compromise, and then so that leads to the question of is this effective? And I think in the U.S. Like there's a consensus that it's effective to a degree, but everybody thinks it could be improved, and I think that's what lawmakers try to do constantly. For example, I'll just um, now we talk about these commodity support programs, the almost 66 billion added to support agriculture in July. Yet there's already talk of needing more support for farmers because of things like you talk about the efficiency of farming is due in large part through technical innovation, which has raised costs. Other production costs, like fertilizers and pesticides, that brings the prices up. So even though on the one hand you have this massive infusion of funding for agriculture, the costs farmers are incurring are also continue to go up. And with some of the trade deals going on with inflation, that's still projected to go higher. So then it becomes, okay, how much more support can you give agriculture? And I think that's where and what about the effectiveness there? What's the general consensus? What's effective? What could be improved? I'm curious if it's a similar debate, based on input cost and markets.
I mean, it's difficult to say. Effectiveness in the public sphere or in a policy framework often means in the end whether or not the idea finds a majority.
Mm-hmm.
So and then is the question, okay, how do you get from a, let's say, scientifically sound idea to a politically sound idea? And how do you incorporate all those different interests and beliefs as well on how agriculture should work in order to end up with a bill or with a program that can be supported? And this is, I think, one main reason why this field is so complex and why it is so difficult to say, well, it's a good idea, because in the end, in the political sphere, good means it passes. So it's 101 member of our, well, the big chamber, the Nationalrat, the National Council. So this is like the threshold. It's good if it passes 101 votes. Is this a good measure for the goodness of a bill? I have my doubts, but this is how the policy making is partly working.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because that kind of brings up a point of, you mentioned the political versus the the scientifically based or the practical, and that's one of the things we're facing in the U.S. right now. When for example, immigration, there's you have farmer. Oh, well, you have this with when the president came in, one of his big priorities was deporting people who are in the country illegally, and making prioritizing Americans for jobs in the United States. Well, farmers who are employing people from Mexico and Central America on their farms are not pushing for those policies for their workers. They're happy with their workers. They're cost effective. The workers want that. They're not pushing that, but they still supported President Trump for other reasons. 80-something% of rural America have voted for President Trump, even though policies like this are counterintuitive to their needs. Or I'll give you another example. Funding for programs that look to mitigate climate change. That was a big priority under President Biden, and there were a lot of incentive-based programs to encourage farmers to utilize certain practices where they would get credits if these practices they used were shown to mitigate climate change. President Trump is ordering USDA to make no references to climate change in agriculture legislation. There are some conservation programs, but it's and that's part of right now the Republican Party of the United States
But that,
is.
that's kind. I mean, to my understanding, this is quite dangerous for agriculture.
In the long term, yes, and I think you look at any scientific study and you see here's what's happening, whether it's air quality, whether it's soil health, and without mitigation efforts, you could cite a number of studies that show that this will be bad for agriculture long term. But the way President Trump and a lot of Republicans have spun this is that this is not real. This is government getting in the way of your that is cut. A popular phrase is we're cutting government red tape. We're going to get these regulations out of the way and just let you farm. And that,
And what is then the effect on farming? I mean, for the farmer's best, it's in his or her self-interest to keep soil healthy, to mitigate some risks at least. So it seems that the government is kind of abandoning the farmers to have to care themselves about the environment.
yeah,
Or
it, there's a certain attitude, I think, where you'll hear farmers are the best stewards of their land. Nobody loves their land more than farmers, which is overall true,
yeah,
especially when you're talking about these, small scale farmers. But at the end of the day, without these programs, there's no accountability to ensure everybody is utilizing these practices, and there's no incentive for people to adopt newer practices that might have a greater effect. So I don't think anybody doubts the farmers love their land, but it's the whole keep the government. And I think you've told me about farmers in Switzerland with similar sentiment.
yes,
There's still this desire to keep government away, and the only way to ensure these work is if there's verification and processes, and people get frustrated with the slow pace and the steps you have to take to get your credits and to adhere to these practices, and there's just this desire to get government off my land, let me farm, leave me alone, um, for better or worse. But yeah, long-term implications that potentially could lead to some problems, a lot of problems.
yes, and this is an interesting. Well, it's almost a sidetrack, but only almost, because one reason why to increase spending on in agriculture, well, of course there is income support, but one other reason you just mentioned before is that the adoption of new technology.
Right.
So in order to fasten innovation cycle, so the ag sector can be, well, less harming and more efficient overall. And this is something from a conceptual perspective, a very important thing. However, in Switzerland, it is seldomly talked about. So what happens then is like, okay, government phases in a new program for the adoption of any technology. The early adopters, they already jumped on the train and say, hey, let's go. This is a good thing, cool stuff. We do it. Then you have the majority that joins in, well, more or less as planned. And then there are late adopters and the latecomers. And what we see there is, for those latecomers, it is the most interesting to be politically active, to block the phase out of certain programs in order to keep them, in order to not change their way of production. And this is a very strange, or in the first moment, a very unfamiliar pattern. And it took me some time to realize that, especially for people being adversely affected from any policy change, for those people, it is much more beneficial for them to engage in the public debate.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the reason I can say that is, in Switzerland, the public debate and the accessibility to politics is very good. I mean, you have the possibilities at the municipality or in the region you live. You can become very soon part of any committee and voice your concerns and then rise through the ranks if you want to. So we are very proud of this openness of the political system. But however, one downside is people who are negatively affected of it, they tend to scream louder than all the others. And it's most of the cases it are minorities. It is important to protect those minorities. But here, if we talk about the adoption of technology, we see there this, it slows down the whole process.
Yeah.
And the question is, what is then the problem of that? However, I have to watch on our timer, and what we can see, we almost lost it again. Next time, what we're going to discuss next time will be even more interesting, I think, because we are asking the question, how can we actually improve agricultural policy? And before doing so, the last question, what would you say? Does public spending in agriculture make sense at all?
I would say, and I think most people in the U.S. would agree that public spending on agriculture, on some level, or makes sense. But then, like you said, everything we've talked about for the past 30 minutes here, who benefits, how much money, that's the debate. But I don't think it's a question that public spending is needed, and I think that's one of the few issues that you would get consensus of both parties here. But yeah, I think this is a good lead in. Talking about how people can get involved, what would improve. I think that's a good lead in to our next episode, and I'm definitely looking forward to a spirited discussion on that.
Yeah, me too. So what do we take out of this episode then?
I think we take out of there's a lot to talk about, and as you can see from the amount of time we've gone on, I mean, we're good at talking about stuff, but it's a lot of conflicting interests. It's a lot of trying to address, when you say agriculture policy, that affects so many things, and trying to put it all under one umbrella. Really just highlights, all of the different priorities and the complexity of the issue, and getting, a Congress or Parliament to agree to something requires, lots of compromises, lots to consider, lots of ideas. It's massively complex, but I think we can safely say it's something that needs to be done. And next time we talk, we'll talk about some of the things that you and I think should be done. So
yes, we try to.
Yeah. So for everyone out there, thanks for listening to us. And if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to subscribe, share, and send us your feedback. Thank you very much. This has been the Agricultural Policy Podcast. I'm Josh Baethge. This is Hansjürg Jäger. We're looking forward to hearing from you again next month.